Good morning, everyone. My name is Shreya Thatai, and I have the honor of introducing Deborah Amos to all of you this morning. Ms. Amos currently serves as an international correspondent at NPR, where she focuses on the Middle East. Her stories range from topics such as Syrian youth to Iraqi refugees and can be heard on programs like Morning Edition and Weekend Edition. She studied broadcasting at the University of Florida, Gainesville, and afterwards began her first work at NPR in the late 1970s at Weekend, All Things Considered. Her work in the following decade took her abroad to the UK and Jordan. Afterwards, she changed gears to television news, where she worked at ABC's Nightline, among other places. She returned to NPR in 2003 and has since won awards such as the Edward Weintel Prize for Diplomatic Reporting, granted by Georgetown University, and the Edward Murrow Lifetime Achievement Award from Washington State University. Today, Ms. Amos will be speaking to us about the immigration crisis, a dialogue that will fit well into our recent conversations regarding the roles and responsibilities of the press in our shifting geopolitical climate. So without further ado, please join me in welcoming Ms. Deborah Amos to our Albright stage.
Thank you. And I always say thank you for keeping that short. Nobody pays attention after the first two lines. Hello, everyone. Some of you know me. You've heard my voice on the radio, so thank you for letting me walk around in your heads. Radio is an intimate collaboration between the listeners and the reporters. What I've been doing lately is I've been bringing stories about the refugee experience to national public listeners. For many years, I was a war correspondent. Unfortunately, there are no peace correspondents, so I was a war correspondent, and refugees was just a part of my beat, because that's what wars do, and in fact, some wars actually try to create refugees. Now, I am, for the first time actually in my career, a domestic correspondent, and I have been focusing on refugee resettlement in America. And I've been doing it because, as an international correspondent, it is almost impossible to ignore this, that we are in the middle of an epic shift on the planet. There are some 65 million human beings on the move today. It's more than the population of California and Texas combined. It's bigger than France. It's bigger than England. It's the biggest wave of mass migration since the Second World War. It's the most, and where you see this dramatic phenomenon is on the Mediterranean Sea. Somewhere around 5,000 people have died, drowned, trying to get from Africa and the Middle East to Europe. And what they're fleeing is no surprise. These are wars that have lasted for decades. Think of Afghanistan. Syria has lasted now for 6 years. Iraq has been going for more than a decade. Add to that climate change refugees. We are starting to see those people move. And we have people whose political systems have simply collapsed. Let's think about Eritrea. These are people who have no future where they are. And these are the entrepreneurial spirits. These are the people who are willing to take risks. These are the people who are moving to Europe. I wanted to give you a little bit of an idea about the trek and how dangerous it is. And so I'm going to read the opening passages to a really interesting book. It's called The New Odyssey, the story of Europe's refugee crisis. It's now in paperback and I think worth reading and following. And the book opens with a Syrian refugee named Hashim. He starts his journey from the coast of Egypt after he and his family have to get out of Syria. In the darkness far out to sea, Hashim al-Suki can't see his neighbors, but he can hear them scream. It's partly his fault. They are two African women, perhaps from Somalia, but now is not the time to ask. Hashim is spread eagle on top of them. His limbs dig into theirs. They want him to move, and so does he, but he can't. Several people are sprawled on top of him. Dozens are crammed into this wooden dinghy. A smuggler kicks them back into place. They don't want the crammed boat to overbalance and then sink. There are people from across Africa here, others from across the Middle East. They want to get to Northern Europe, Sweden, Germany, or anywhere that offers them a better future than their collapsed homelands. For that distant hope, they're risking this boat trip to the Italian coast. They should reach Italy in 5 or 6 days, but for now, Hashem doesn't know if he'll survive the night or if anyone on this boat will. An hour passes, they reach a second boat, a bigger one, and then a third, bigger still. At each new vessel, the smugglers toss them over the side like bags of potatoes. Now they have a bit more space, but they're soaked. They had to wade through the waves to get to the dinghy, and the second boat is full of water. Their clothes drenched, they shiver, and then they retch. The person squeezed to his left pukes all over Hashem. Then Hashem plays the favor forward, spewing all over the person to his right. He looks up and realizes everyone is at it. Each has paid more than $2,000 to spew over fellow refugees and a chance to get to Europe. This is what it's like in the Mediterranean most days. European officials believe that over 3 million more migrants could follow by 2018 as the civil wars in Syria, Afghanistan, and Iraq push this unprecedented number of people to Europe. And let's ask ourselves, what has been the response to this move of humanity? Fear, walls, border guards. Denmark passed a law a year ago that allows authorities to confiscate valuables from migrants. And there was a huge international backlash to this law, and they waited until June to actually use it for the first time, where they took $11,000 from a group of Iranians who had landed with fake passports. We've also seen a rightward shift in elections. Immigration played a role in the Brexit vote. There's now an identifiable alt-right movement here and in Europe. Here in the West, we talk much more about the other. We call them illegal people. Political leaders say we don't know who they are, but they are certain that these illegal people are out to take something away from the safe and the comfortable. You know, we've been here before. Most of us in this room, is my guess, certainly in my case, we have family stories about grandparents who escaped persecution, maybe a pogrom, a potato famine, ancestors who jumped across borders to find work and to change their fortunes. And some of them certainly faced what today's migrants face: prejudice, rejection, bigotry, mistreatment. But here we are. After a generation or two in the country, there comes acceptance, even respect for the entrepreneurial spirit of immigrants. Let's think of that famous Syrian, Steve Jobs, or the namesake of this institute, Madeleine Albright, the former Secretary of State. These names and their journeys have been part of the great American narrative until now. In this country, we are in a civil war over immigration. Yes, the complaints are about illegal immigration, but make no mistake, the war is on legal and refugee resettlement, which is also legal. It's all the same target. In one of the final opinion pieces of the year in the New York Times, a junior senator from Arkansas, Tom Cotton, called for the curtailment of legal immigration, all of it, the whole program. Just stop it right now. And what he charged was that the system was bringing in too many unskilled, low-skilled workers that were undercutting wages for American workers. Fake news, not true. You can look up the studies on the Migration Policy Study Institute in Washington, and you will note their figures that say that there has been a recent surge of college-educated immigrants coming to this country, more than 50%. 1/3 of all refugees coming to the country are college-educated. I think for a lot of us, and why you can have an article like that printed, it's really hard to see big seismic events. 65 million, how is that possible that you can comprehend what that means? It's bigger than Texas and California, it's bigger than England or France, but really, it's hard to understand 65 million because they aren't all gathered in one place. Now I'm going to give you a smaller number, 5 million. That's the number of Syrian refugees after almost 6 years of war. Half of the country's population of 22 million has been uprooted by that war between a tyrant and the militants of the Islamic State. Almost 500,000 people have been killed in that country. These are huge, huge numbers to wrap our heads around. So to help us make sense of a big story, we need the intimacy of the individual. And this is what journalists know. You need anecdotal stories that represent the whole. One refugee is a tragedy. Two is a statistic. So how do you report on what motivates people to board one of those flimsy boats with their young children, or walk on the back lanes or the forests of Europe in the freezing cold? So this is why it takes individual stories to tell the bigger story. In the summer of 2015, I was in southern Turkey, and the Syrian Exodus had started to build. Most Syrians clung to their homelands as long as possible, even as the country was collapsing around them. Turkey, they saw, was a temporary refuge. It was a place to wait out the war. But 2015 was a really interesting turning point, and to be on the ground was interesting to watch it up close. Because inside that larger crisis, there was a number of smaller ones, and a lot of it was about education. There was also a conscription crisis, but that had to do with education as well. And at the same time, there was a calculation among Syrians in 2015, in that summer, that the timeline for going home was now at least a generation away. This was 2 million people making the same calculation, and that's how many at that time were in southern Turkey. Here was part of their calculation. A long-term stay in Turkey's waiting room was no longer tenable. Citizenship, a passport, it wasn't possible in Turkey. There was really no path for that. And at the 5-year mark, it was now becoming almost impossible to renew a Syrian passport. So you were almost certain to be without any documents where you could legally cross a border, get on an airplane, move. The other problem was relicensing. There were many, many professionals who'd fled to Turkey. Doctors, dentists, all kinds of professionals. There was no path to relicensing in Turkey. The Turks just didn't have it because there'd been no crisis like this. There'd been no large group of people who'd come to the country, educated professionals, who needed to be relicensed. So if you were a dentist or a doctor, you were stuck. There was no way to see a future for you. And so a future in Turkey, a long-term one, didn't exist. There was the language barrier. Syrian kids couldn't go to Turkish schools because they didn't speak Turkish. They only spoke Arabic. 5 years in, you had to kind of make a decision. Were you going to invest in learning Turkish, or was it just easier to go learn German? That was a more useful language. And those were calculations that people were making. Syrians' exiled professional class had organized a private Arabic school system along the border. But in the summer of 2015, more than a dozen Syrian schools in Turkey were closing because after 5 years of war, private donors were simply exhausted. They had run out of money. And most of those schools, when they closed for the summer, that was mostly for good. The exodus began because there was going to be no school in that following September. The exodus inside Syria also began at the end of a school year. It was the university school year because that was when young Syrian men lost their deferments and they became eligible for the draft. Now, maybe they were against the Syrian rebels, and certainly many of them were, but they weren't prepared to die for President Bashar al-Assad's endless war. And then there was the activists. For them, it was a sense of futility to get on those boats. Again, I ask, how do we absorb 5,000 people dying, drowning, trying to reach Europe in these flimsy boats? It's a huge number, and we've seen one small boy on the coast looking like he was sleeping, and that moved us. But it still happens every day, and nobody is moved every day. And in fact, nobody really was moved to do much of anything after that picture. So it's a problem for people taking on these numbers. But we can, in some ways, understand the despair of one. And I'm going to tell you about Hibba Izzadeen and the reasons that she used her savings for a boat ride in that summer. Hibba is a 35-year-old college English professor, somebody we can identify with. She was from Raqqa, Syria, a place that was taken over by ISIS. She joined the protests against Assad in 2011. She was one of the first on the street. She believed this was a democratic uprising, and she wanted to be part of it. But Islamists took over, first in her town and then in the entire province. So then she organized opposition to the radicals by starting a website with a group of underground journalists and posting what was happening so Syrians would know how to rebel against the Islamists as they had against Assad. What was ironic for her is that many of the young radicals were her former students. She actually knew them personally, and she was horrified by their ideology and what was happening in Syria. And so her opposition made sense to her. It was rewarding. She was recognized by Western governments, including the US, and they even funded her project. And she seemed committed to sticking it out to shape Syria's future. When I met her on a quiet summer day near the Syrian border, but a few weeks later, shocking for me, her resolve had collapsed. And she said, "Suddenly I felt we were doing nothing serious for the people," she explained via Skype, when I reached her in a refugee camp on the German border a few weeks after we met on the Turkish border. It was one night, she said, I had to make a decision. I didn't sleep. Is there a future in Turkey? And I said no. So after posting her decision on Facebook, which is how I knew about it, she set off alone from southern Turkey for a journey of more than 1,000 miles. She paid for a seat on an overcrowded raft, rode in a sealed truck, walked through a forest, slept on the street, and in a jail cell to reach Northern Europe. Izzadeen had weighed all the risks. She consulted Facebook and internet forums that explained every step along the way. It listed the ferry schedules, cheap hotels, and the best answers to border guards, because those interrogations could mean the difference between getting through a border and not. Even for Hibba, the journey was filled with unexpected dangers. She survived 2 failed attempts to escape at sea. Smugglers actually stopped a crowded boat she was in at gunpoint, and they stole the engine from that boat. And so all of the passengers on her dinghy had to paddle back to shore. On her second attempt, she was on an overcrowded, smoke-belching wooden ferry, and it began to sink 5 hours after being lost in the water. The Greek Coast Guard saved them, but she said they yelled at us continually while they were hauling us up on a boat to safety. "Why do you people keep coming?" The landing on the Greek island was that beginning of the 20-day Odyssey through the Balkan route, that's what it's called. And her traveling companions included a wounded rebel commander and a regime supporter from Damascus. Now, they were all in the same boat. And what she said to me is, my camp, more than half of the people are regime supporters. And they were all waiting for asylum papers. She says, really, it is strange. I can see her now on Facebook. She shows up. I can follow her progress there. There she is without a headscarf. She decided that in Europe she was not going to wear one, in full makeup. I never saw that in southern Turkey. She's a dynamic young woman, not that those two things mean anything, but this is how she's decided to identify herself. She wants to find a future in Europe. She wants to go back to work. She wants to go back to school. She wants to teach again. Still a dynamic young woman, a risk taker, a person who thinks on her feet, someone that any employer would judge entrepreneurial, the kind of person that you want on a staff. But will Europe allow Hibba to have a future? You know, there's a lot of Hibbas moving into Europe. Educated people who see that this is a place they might have a future. But the problem is, will Europe let them have it? It's possible that Hibba and others like her will break Europe into a collection of authoritarian governments who are pro-razor wire and punishing policies against these newcomers. And so we are going to have to watch whether this dynamic group of newcomers will add to Europe or detract. There are Hibbas who have also arrived here. And they come at a time when we all have witnessed an ugly strain of populism. It's another version of the culture wars. It's an assault on multicultural America. Last year, more than 30 governors, all but one a Republican, publicly rejected accepting any Syrian refugees. They said they were dangerous, they are Muslim, the U.S. intelligence agencies are not capable enough of vetting these Syrians. The most prominent in this position is Mike Pence. He's now the vice president-elect. And he actually went to court to block Syrian refugee resettlement in his state. He lost twice. His proposal was deemed unconstitutional. You cannot ban people when taking into account race or religion or ethnic background. And so a judge rightly declared that it was unconstitutional to ban one group of refugees. And so Indiana now does resettle Syrian refugees in a federal program. And they've put their budget in, and there are families coming to Indiana. But even so, on that day when the first family arrived in Indiana, the Refugee Resettlement Agency decided that it was safer to reroute them to Connecticut because nobody knew what was going to happen. They were worried that the National Guard was going to show up at the airport. And they got a rousing reception in Connecticut. People of Indiana who were ashamed of what had happened started sending teddy bears to Connecticut. They were inundated with teddy bears. And all was well at the end. But it is one battle in this new culture war. The debate about refugee resettlement is likely to be a flashpoint starting in January. It figured prominently in the elections, so it's hard to believe that it won't figure prominently in the first months of the new administration. And we can see now that it's also headed to states where legislatures are beginning to consider bills to try to restrict the federal program. Montana is one example. They just took 9 refugee families from January to early December, but they're considering in the next few weeks a dozen bills related to refugees, immigration, and terrorism. And some of the measures are interesting, and I'm going to challenge you to pay attention to this as it comes through state legislatures in the following 12 months, because my suspicion is you will see the same legislation posed in many states. And that is things like requiring resettlement agencies to carry insurance that would defray the cost of prosecuting refugees who commit violent crimes. There are no examples of that in the last 2 years, but nevertheless, those are the kind of expenses that can shut down a program. Also, the legislation asked for cities and towns to request a moratorium or to take a vote on whether immigrants or refugees can come to their towns. This is unprecedented in America, but this is the kind of legislation that is being passed around the country. Refugee rights advocates say that these measures are a sign of what's to come, as this anti-refugee rhetoric that featured in the campaign spills over into the states. It's a national strategy by a small but organized group of anti-immigration, anti-refugee groups. They have been on the fringes so far. They are moving to the mainstream as some of the cabinet picks for the next administration sit on the board of some of these groups. And when you begin to look at their websites, you realize that some of the campaign rhetoric came from those websites. And you see them in Montana, Michigan, in Rutland, Vermont, places where refugee resettlements are coming. These are the battlegrounds. Since 2014, the U.S. has resettled 15,000 Syrians. It's a small fraction of the overall numbers, and certainly not the wave that we heard about in the presidential campaigns. But they may be the last Syrians in. The president has complete authority to set the numbers of refugees. Obama set it at 110,000. That can be reversed on January 21st. It is the prerogative of the president to set the numbers. It's the prerogative of Congress to budget for a refugee resettlement program. So let's talk a bit about what we would lose. We would lose the story of a refugee resettlement agency in Connecticut that encourages volunteers to directly resettle Syrians in their neighborhoods. And in Connecticut, the sign-ups include a car dealership in New Haven and a 350-year-old church in Old Lyme. 50 groups have volunteered to raise $10,000 to research bus routes and translators, to follow federal regulations that include, and this is my favorite federal regulation, you must supply a refugee family with a culturally appropriate meal within 48 hours after arrival. And so these groups in Connecticut have to figure out what a Syrian dinner looks like. Here's what else we would lose. And you'll see that my theme tends to be food. If anybody's eaten Syrian cuisine, you'll know why. A Syrian cafe in Highland Park, New Jersey. And there, they have a peace cafe that employs refugee chefs. One from a different place for every day of the week. So these are home-cooked meals. The church makes some money on it. But really what it's about is bringing the community in around food so that you can integrate these refugees better over this common thing that we humans share, and that is the love of lunch. Girls Rising in Chicago. This is an NGO organization in Chicago that matches mentors with young girls who come in as refugees, and they are set up in 5 high schools in Chicago. For girls who come from cultures where, and I say this in an all-female school, where these girls have never gone to school with boys, and coming to America is culturally overwhelming for them, and they lose their voice. They do. And so Girls Rising is summer camps, high school safe spaces, a way to help teenage refugee girls find their voice in this culture. I've been a war correspondent most of my career, so refugee reporting was part of that beat. Since June, it's now full-time refugee, because my company, NPR, had the foresight to understand that this was going to be an issue, at least till the election. It didn't really project past the election. None of us did. But now this is a relevant issue going into the future. I've been following one Syrian family, and I've done it as a long-term project. It's Osama and Ghada. They came to Princeton, New Jersey in May. And the whole idea of this project is to do the day-to-day struggle, because who meets a refugee? You know, there's so few of them, really. Hardly anybody even studies them. The population is too small. We are focusing on a group we know nothing about. We're the ones who don't know who they are. Politicians know very well who they are and have the ability to ask who they are, but we're the ones who don't know who they are. They're resettled in 38 states, so the chance of you running into one is lower than being struck by lightning. So the idea was that I would follow one family and we would watch what it's like to resettle in America. You have Osama. In his early 40s, he was blinded by a mortar shell that hit his uncle's house in a Damascus suburb in 2012. The whole family went to Jordan. They stayed for 3 years. They applied to the UN when they first got there. And then Nassau Presbyterian Church in Princeton resettled them in May of this year. That's not a big surprise. First of all, Nassau has been doing this for 50 years. 10 families, one every 5 years. Cubans, Bosnians, Burmese, Vietnamese, and now Syrians. But historically, it is faith-based communities that do the refugee resettlement in this country. Mostly the evangelicals in the South, Catholics and mainstream Protestants in the Northeast, synagogues and mosques work together to support these newcomers. And I see it in New Jersey and Montclair. There's a synagogue there that's organized a Syrian food night once a month that brings in the community. Where I live in Princeton, the Mosque of Central New Jersey, I've spent more time in mosques since I've been back to the States than I did actually in the Middle East. And there we had a fabulous Thanksgiving dinner for this Syrian family with a wonderful Palestinian dish, maklouba. That's new for me as a Thanksgiving, cultural touchstone, but fine by me. All of these things that I'm telling you about, this is the flip side of the culture war. It's the untold story, and it doesn't really get much attention in the mainstream media. Do you know that the Rust Belt cities in the Northeast are welcoming migrants and refugees because they see them as an economic boost for towns that have been depopulated? Ithaca, New York, 1 out of every 4 residents is a refugee or an immigrant because they ask them to come, because they need them, they need that entrepreneurial spirit. I just did a piece that was on the radio yesterday morning. It's about a Chicago cheesecake factory that's been hiring refugees for 20 years. So does Marriott, so does Wells Fargo, and yes, so does Trump Tower Hotel in Chicago. Trump Tower has been hiring refugees forever. And you just have to ask Refugee 1 in Chicago, who does the placements, that they are always asking because they make good employees. They're mostly older. They stick on the job. Job retention is through the roof, as I was told by the guy from Refugee 1. So these are all compelling human stories, and it's part of this bigger story in the country. They change us, we change them. It's the American narrative. I have just done a series of stories about the holiday season. It was one of the favorite things I've done in a long time because it forced me to think about America. Because the holiday season is a crash course in American culture. And, bing, 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 there's 3 of them. The first big celebration is about candy and children and strangers coming to your home and asking for food. The second one, it's pretty easy. It's mostly about family and food, and it's easy for a refugee to get that one. Now, the Christmas season is supposed to be about religion, but we all know it's mostly about buying stuff. So try to imagine your first Halloween if you've never seen it before, and try to imagine coming from an authoritarian society where power is projected through every official position, every single one that you come upon in your daily life. And then try to imagine the reaction when you see for the first time the school principal of your children's new school in a battery-powered cat ear and tail. So I had the privilege of attending the local Halloween parade at an elementary school in Princeton where the teachers and the kids dressed up. And I saw it for the first time through the eyes of a refugee parent. This is America, and it's really weird. When I taught at Princeton in the spring, the majority of my students chose to write about the immigration crisis. And this year, I got an email on a Thursday to say, come tomorrow to Rutgers and you will see one of the early parts of the Holt Prize. And I didn't know what the Holt Prize was, but I looked it up. And it's the largest student competition for entrepreneurial ideas to solve the world's big problems. You know what it is this year? It's to solve the refugee crisis. And at Rutgers, I watched business students make a plan for solar bicycles. And you would, the currency was pedaling. So if you wanted to check out a bike, you would come and pedal for a while and make some power that would also connect to solar panels, and then you could take out the bike. And they are moving up the line. But that's this year's Holtz Prize. And I think these two things are indicative. I think your generation does feel this culture war acutely and care about it, because I think that you see it more clearly than people in my generation. And so in this fog of post-fact America, I understand you were talking about fake news before I got here, I think that you can do some things, you activists. You can find faith-based communities that are supporting refugees and migrants, whether you're religious or not. They're interesting and they're smart, and they are activists in a way that has surprised me. You can advocate for refugee resettlement, because economists have shown that refugees contribute to their resettlement community in substantial ways. They pay taxes. They bring new ideas to the community. Some win Nobel Prizes, some open institutes at Wellesley. We have one of the oldest resettlement programs in America. It's actually a Republican idea. It came after the Second World War. It was a Cold War idea. And the idea was that anybody who could get out from under the Iron Curtain had a place in America. So the problem was they really couldn't get here. But it leads to the Cuban Exodus and Cubans being allowed to come to America. It leads to Soviet Jews who came. It leads to the Vietnamese coming in substantial numbers to this country, and then the Bosnians. This, historically, is us. It works a little different now. Now it is the UNHCR that does the first choosing, and how it works is that we ask for the most vulnerable refugees, and that means single women head of household. It means torture victims, LGBTQ. It means disabled people. This is how the family in Princeton got here, a blind father who is actually getting his first chance at learning how to read Braille and learning how to walk with a white cane. That's who we ask for. Our doors have been open for decades. We've posted some more guards on them since 9/11. We have an extreme vetting process for the 1% of worldwide refugees who are eligible to come here. Our melting pot is our national narrative. We are a nation of diversity. It's the theme of our most traditional songs and movies. That narrative is now challenged. And you, as a generation, have to decide if this is an issue that you want to fight about. Thank you very much.